here at Policy Exchange, particularly to address issues that have perhaps been neglected to head in think tank terms, at least, towards the sound of gunfire. There are many in the room who've actually done literal gunfire here, but it's important to have, as it were, intellectual courage, and our panelists today all have that in spadefuls. The first part, as you know, will be in conversation between Sir Michael Fallon, distinguished former UK Defence Secretary. For those in the outside world who are listening and don't follow his every manoeuvre every day, but he's always welcome here, has been a great friend to Policy Exchange through the years, and another great friend of Policy Exchange, General David Petraeus, who's visited us through the years, first as Commander in Iraq, then as Head of CENTCOM, and then as Com ISAF, and we thank you, salute you for your friendship. You're not quite Victor Ludorum for distance travel today. One of our distinguished South Korean visitors has come here for that, wins that prize today, but people from all over Eastern Europe and countries in the front line that are affected by both of the legs of the double bill that we're presenting today. The first one, you are 80 years on, what have we learned, being conversation, then the second, the panel event with General Petraeus, with Air Chief Marshal Lord Peach, distinguished former Chief of Defence Staff and Chairman of NATO's Military Committee, General Lindberg from Finland, former Finnish Chief of Defence Staff, now Finnish MP, and Lord Verdirame, one of the preeminent practitioners in this country and indeed in Europe of public international law and law of armed conflict, who will be a participant chairman in the second leg today. And in particular significance, particular pleasure to me, and for those journalists who are here, I'm sure they'll all be aware, but many others besides, that simultaneous to the second leg of our double bill today, the present Attorney General, Lord Hermer, KC rather, will be addressing the theme of law and national security in a Rusi address down the road. So I think we'll have a bit of yin and yang and a bit of some very piquant contrasts today, which is exactly what the think tank sector should be doing. So thank you, Sir Michael, thank you, General, for your friendship, and I know everyone's keen to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dean, and good afternoon. And General David, let me repeat that welcome. It's an honour to have you here again at Policy Exchange at a time of growing insecurity around the world, and I think a growing appetite for the kind of insights that you and other colleagues who've served out there against these challenges might be able to bring us. Perhaps I could start, as we are in the month where we've marked the 80th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day. Could I just go back a little? For that day here, we remember how our parents served at the end of 6 very long years of war. I wonder how you reflected on that particular anniversary.
Well, it was the crusade, as Eisenhower put it, at least in Europe, and a war like no other. Thankfully, we came out on the winning end of it because we all worked together so effectively. Your war, of course, was even longer than America's war. It took us a while to get in. It wasn't until we were attacked at Pearl Harbor that we actually did join the effort. I reflect a little bit because my own father was a captain and officer in the U.S. Merchant Marine, which actually was on the seas well before we actually declared war. Having come from the Netherlands, where he went to the navigation school and so forth, was on a Dutch ship at sea down in the West Indies, I think they were called, the Caribbean, when the Nazis overran Holland, and they had nowhere to go, couldn't go back to Rotterdam certainly, so they came up the coast and took a left into the harbor, turned right into Brooklyn Navy Yard and asked if they were hiring. But it was a very, very long war for them, and it actually had the highest per capita casualties. And one in which they went all around the world, not just Europe or the Pacific, but in all of them. We all look at this, I think, through the eyes of our parents, as you note. And really that was where the special relationship, I think, manifested its greatest impact on the world and has really continued ever since.
it was an Allied victory, as you said.
Yeah.
In your campaigns in Iraq and Afghan, you had to work together, meld together very different strengths, capabilities, different insights. What were the challenges in doing that? I mean,
Well, there were huge challenges in doing that.
But did you learn much from the way we'd worked
I
together
think
before?
I did. I'd like to think I did. I think we actually relearned because it had been a long time since we'd had anything. And in truth, even in Iraq, it was quite different. What you had was a U.S.-led multinational force. There was not a NATO chain of command. It was directly really back to the Pentagon through the Central Command. It was much cleaner, frankly, to command that than it was to command the NATO coalition, the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, where I had to be dual-headed. I had to be U.S. commander because there are certain assets that we will never put under a coalition commander, our Joint Special Operations Command, Special Mission Units in particular, but lots of others actually as well. And then you had the NATO command as well. So much cleaner. And the truth is that the coalition in Iraq was largely U.S. Predominantly. Good UK contingent, of course, in a tough area down in the south. Others, not the central fight, certainly not in the Sunni-Shia civil war that erupted probably starting in early 2006. Afghanistan was the place where you really had to be conscious of a number of different realities. And I constantly reflected on that great comment by Churchill that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. And I truly believe that is absolutely true. But I had to be conscious of something I learned actually as the operations chief in Bosnia, where I had a matrix underneath the glass on my desk that had the countries down one side and the missions, types of missions on the top, and a tick in the box whether that country would do, for example, counterterrorism after 9/11. Riot control could be moved outside their area. That was child's play compared with Afghanistan, where the caveats were in every single country, and regrettably, we found that the UK even had caveats when we tried to move the forces that were in Helmand province 3 villages over to allow the Marines to go into a more difficult area in western Kandahar. And Prime Minister Cameron was out in Kabul 3 days later and acquainted us with the realities of London politics and so forth, and we did not end up moving them over.
You couldn't move them in.
We could not move them over. Yeah. So that was, again, that turned to be a little bit of a myth.
And did that flow from the fact it was a NATO mission?
It flowed from the fact that I think there was a concern that there would be something done that could result in casualties, which would then be hung around the neck of a prime minister who allowed that to happen. I mean, again, I'm a soldier, but I do have to have insights into the political situations in various countries. But the bottom line is that every single country had some caveats and had some limitations, shortcomings, issues, and the only way you could compensate for those was with U.S. forces, U.S. capabilities. There always had to be a U.S. intelligence plug. We would have to put a team into a coalition country. You often lacked air medevac in some of the countries. There was one country that will remain nameless, but is now a member of NATO, that had a caveat that they could not conduct offensive operations. That's a bit limiting. We resolved that very easily. We gave them a company of 82nd Airborne Division paratroopers who are offensive by nature, and who would conduct the offensive, immediately get in trouble. This is all an SOP, and then that particular country's forces would come to the rescue. And it was well practiced, and it worked out just fine. But we had to, again, special forces. We were conducting a lot of different, both special mission unit and regular special forces. When it came to the local police program, the ALP program, which should have been done 6 years earlier. So it was much more complicated in Afghanistan. I could not, in Afghanistan, do what I did in Iraq, which was the U.S. ambassador and I were always joined at the hip. Every time I went to see Prime Minister Maliki, he would come with me, and vice versa. I couldn't do that. The U.S. ambassador in Afghanistan was just one of many who thought they were pretty important diplomatically. And I also had a NATO senior civilian representative. So who do you choose? So it was, again, much less clean. And frankly, I was responding to two different masters. The NATO SecGen would be rightly asking for what is the plan for transition, what are the conditions. We didn't have it at all when I came in, and yet I was told that we were going to start transitioning during the course of that year, and we did, by the way. So it was a very, very interesting setup there. We didn't have the U.S. commander dual-hatted as the U.S. commander. He was actually, until actually when I came in, that was when we started that. General McChrystal deserves a lot of credit. First for getting the big ideas right, then for helping with the process that almost gets the input nearly right. And it took us, by the way, this is a huge lesson, it took us 8 years to get the right strategy, and it took us another year to get almost the right inputs. Not quite, we didn't have quite the level of forces that we needed in some of the other enablers, but we largely did. The challenge there, candidly, was that the way you should conduct a drawdown, which is based on conditions on the ground, objective military and security conditions on the ground, did govern the first drawdown, but pretty quickly after that, it became conditions in Washington that determined the pace of the drawdown rather than conditions on the ground, including the final withdrawal, which I felt was, it is not axiomatic that you have to end endless wars. You can actually keep going as long as they're sustainable. And sustainability is measured in the expenditure of your blood and your treasure, as you all learned in many centuries of the empire. And if you haven't lost a soldier in 18 months, which was the case when we finally withdrew, and you haven't, and the cost is trivial in an $850 billion defense budget, there's no reason you shouldn't keep going. In fact, there's every reason to continue to go, because and I said so publicly, that I fear a catastrophic collapse of the Afghan security forces when they realize nobody's coming to the rescue. Not just that the U.S. wasn't coming to the rescue, it was that their own commandos, their entire defense strategy hinged on air mobility, because they had basically modestly trained and equipped soldiers and police securing the major population areas and critical infrastructure. When they got hit, members of the 35,000 strong, very well equipped, highly motivated, trained and so forth, commandos would deploy and rescue them. But that hinged on the operational readiness of the overly sophisticated American helicopters that we insisted on giving to them, instead of continuing what I was doing, which was using old Russian refurbished stuff, which they could actually maintain. It was analog, this is digital, and it actually, as predicted, the minute we withdrew not just our forces, and then not just all the NATO forces, which are 3 times the US forces, we withdrew 17,000 Western contractors who were essential to maintaining the helicopters and then the fixed wing fleet that was also quite sophisticated, provided by the US. And the operational readiness of those plummeted. By the way, they actually went to Qatar, and they were conducting maintenance on these very complicated machines and diagnostics and so forth over FaceTime with a translator. That is not the ideal way to maintain sophisticated helicopters.
What are the wider lessons you draw from both of your campaigns? I mean, in terms of melding the military, the economic, the diplomatic, the media, are there lessons there that are applicable to today's
I think they are,
wider
absolutely.
conflicts?
Sure, I think you always want to have a comprehensive approach, and I think the difference would be that it could be much more rapid in the way it unfolds, as opposed to in a way, the slower campaign that was played out there. But no, I think there's no question about that. I think arguably the biggest lesson, and this is one that causes me concern as we see somewhat less than fulsome commitment from the United States, is the fact that really, if you don't have a U.S. foundation and ideally a U.S. commander who's also plugged into the intelligence and all the other assets that you can bring to bear, I'm not sure how successful this can be. Or at least I just have concerns about how it can be. You are very familiar with the campaign in which we, quote, led from behind. This was Libya.
Yeah.
French and Brits drove that campaign. Yeah. President Obama, happy to have you two lead it. The reality was that I think we flew all the combat search and rescue, most of the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, 60 or 70% of the air sorties, and had to loan bombs to both France and the UK after the first week or so of that campaign.
Yeah.
And even it, although there was a NATO, they went to great effort to make it a NATO Combined Air Operations Center. It was still led by an American, as I recall, who actually had been the head of the U.S. Combined Air Operations Center, and so patched all things up and put it together against an enemy that had no air defense and not much of a military response. So that's the challenge that I think looms out there. I was reassured to see that there's still a commitment to a U.S. Supreme Allied Commander Europe. And actually, my response to people who ask is the U.S. still is committed to Article 5, the collective self-defense component of NATO, is, look, do we not still have forces, large numbers of forces, not just in Europe writ large, 100,000 or so, but forces on the ground in the countries that are the most vulnerable, or where Russian aggression could be followed if they were able to achieve what they want to achieve in Ukraine, which is quite maximalist still. And of course, the Baltic states, there are U.S. forces on the ground in every one of those, and that, I think, is the best guarantee of all that the collective security agreement will be honored.
That takes us, naturally up to the forthcoming Hague summit and some of the uncertainties here about the state of the transatlantic partnership. Do you think both sides of that partnership fully understand the extent to which the challenges in Euro-Atlantic actually are enmeshed with the challenges in Indo-Pacific, that it is in the end one conflict?
Well, it is. And I think someone kindly mentioned Andrew Roberts' book earlier when we were in an earlier session, the one that I did with him titled Conflict, the Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Gaza. And we repeatedly note in that book that what you do in one part of the world reverberates in others. Deterrence, at the end of the day, in Indo-Pacific or wherever, is a function of the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to use them on the other. I remember when we had a red line over chemical weapons use in Syria that was crossed, and we did not respond in the way that one might have thought if a red line was crossed. And I was actually in the office of the Prime Minister in Singapore right around that time, and he said, General, what happens there reverberates out, has implications in the Pacific, and that action is undermining deterrence in that particular region. So I think it really is all together. If you don't support your friends in the Middle East, if you don't support a country that shares our values, beliefs, principles, when it comes to the various freedoms we all cherish and have fought for, democracy, free market system, and so forth in Ukraine, however imperfect some of those elements may be, if you don't do that, why would they believe you're going to come to the rescue of someone else in another part of the world? So I think it is all very much connected. I think it all very much does matter. And I think actually, again, there's a recognition of the importance of deterrence in Europe. And frankly, it is great to see the actions that have resulted from President Trump really bludgeoning our European allies and achieving something no other president has in modern times, certainly in the post-Cold War era, which is to be serious about European defense by Europeans. I was a 1-star, 3-star, 4-star NATO guy as well as a U.S. Position. And I attended numerous meetings with numerous presidents, 4 of them, I think, before President Trump, and then going back to when I was what you would say the PSO to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And they railed about Europe's lack of actual spending on their own defense. And now they're finally doing something about it. I mean, Germany's actions in particular could in as much as $1 trillion additional euros on defense. The EU Council just yesterday, I think it was, 150 billion euros. Other countries all making commitments. I'm out and about here quite a bit, and it has been very, very reassuring and quite heartening. So that message has been received. I hope that President Trump will take the win. He should take credit for it, I think. He has done something, again, that no previous president in the post-Cold War era has done, achieved, and that's important. And hopefully again, that can show that we should continue to support countries that are seen to their own defense in a way that has not been in the past.
I'm going to open this up in a few minutes for other questions, so it's not just a dialogue between the two of us. But I just want to take you back again. You've described your campaigns. They were 10 years ago now.
Yeah.
Those campaigns.
Yes.
And there is this tendency, we're talking about the past. How do you see the world now? Do you think it is really more dangerous, more unstable
Very much
than it's
so.
ever been?
Very
Does
much
it worry
so.
you?
It does. So I joined KKR after leaving government over 12 years ago now. I'm the chairman of our Global Institute, which assesses geopolitical risks during the diligence process, ensures that we can mitigate them sufficiently that they won't prevent a successful outcome. And if we judge that they are, we say don't do the deal. We've done that about 7 times in the last 12 years. That's a very big deal when we do that, because the deal team typically has spent a lot of money and time on diligence, and in some cases still wants to go on with it. In every one of those cases, we have not done the deal, and they have come to us later and said, thanks for keeping us from doing it. Your worst fears have been realized. But the world has evolved dramatically during that time. I think 12 years ago, you could describe the world as one of benign globalization. All of the barriers to trade, investment, capital flows, even flow of people and technology, these were all being reduced. Economics largely drove geopolitics, and globalization, as measured by global trade, was going up like this. 12 years later, we're in an era of renewed great power rivalries, mostly as a result of the greater and greater assertiveness of China and their growth and importance, but also, frankly, by obviously what Russia has done, not just in 2014, but then most significantly, of course, in February 2022. And in this case, all of those barriers that were being reduced are now going up. And they actually have been going up for some time. 10% tariffs were put on China in Trump 1.0. President Biden kept them in. President Biden created all kinds of restrictions on what we could sell to China in particular. Remember the high walls around small places? Well, those small places turned out to be not just advanced microchips, but also biotech, quantum, AI, anything connected to surveillance state, dual purpose technologies. The list was quite considerable. And then they put 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles because they had been so subsidized that they were going to come in at half the price of ours and kill that nascent industry at that time. And then, of course, since then, you've had President Trump return to office and threaten various tariffs of various sizes, creating enormous uncertainty about that disruption and so forth. So this is a very, very different time. Geopolitics now is driving economics very significantly, and we really don't know what the resulting trade patterns, supply chains, and so forth will look like, and we won't until we get the final disposition of various tariffs with particular countries or blocs like the EU. So this is a very, very markedly different point. The military threats obviously much, much more manifest. And we actually have what are called investment themes. We're constantly tweaking these. And these are what guide the deal teams. A number of them: rise of the robots, friendshoring, onshoring, increased labor costs in China. What does that mean? Diversifying your manufacturing and assembly. Don't do all iPhones in one place of one country. And they shut it down for COVID for 6 weeks entirely. So now iPhones actually are shifting from China to India and so forth and so on. There's numerous of these. There's one, by the way, called the weaponization of everything, which of course leads to the security of everything. But as we look at these various themes, it's really quite interesting to see how they are pushing, again, what will happen in supply chains. There's one, by the way, we used to have just-in-time logistics. You didn't want to have to invest in warehouses and store all the parts and components. Now it's just-in-case logistics, so warehouses are back in fashion and so on. But it's fascinating to look at that in light of how the world has evolved, and it has evolved so very considerably. And we still don't know where it will end up, because until we know the final numbers of tariffs you really can't determine that.
Okay, we've got time just for 2 quick questions because there's another event starting fairly shortly. So can I plead for a very short question? Yes, sir, on the white jacket.
Matthew Trimming. Is this on?
Shout, come on.
Probably voice activated. You have to speak for a little bit. Well, we can hear you.
Yeah, just in connection to greater EU funding in defence, which is clearly welcomed by everybody, but then greater EU independence of agency outside of NATO, which seems to be an ambition certainly of the French and maybe others. Is that a good thing, or is that a distraction from NATO and the importance of having American leadership on the ground?
I think it is more the latter than the former. I mean, I'm old enough to have seen this. There have been 4 or 5 such initiatives, ESDI, and all while I was participating in NATO in some fashion. I was also the NATO speechwriter for the Supreme Allied Commander as a major. None of them have really material. My point has always been to say, look, tell me how many additional tank battalions or drone battalions now or cyber forces or whatever else, how many actual elements of military capability are you going to generate? Not just another headquarters that's actually going to share ownership of these forces with the actual NATO command structure. I'm much more excited about the overall strategic concept that has been ushered in, which will transform Europe back into the kind of military concepts and command and control and capabilities and so forth that we had during the Cold War. When you remember, you had the 2 American corps, there was 2 German corps, there was the British Army of the Rhine, which was a corps, all lined up along the inter-German border and so forth. So there'd be something much closer to that. And the former Chief of Defense Staff of Finland, I'm sure, can speak to that as they're helping to turn this into reality. We're still a long way from that, though. That's much more exciting to me, though, than the idea that you're going to have yet another European something or other headquarters, which is going to be using the same forces that are planned for use by SACEUR.
Can you make it quick?
Yeah, of course.
Go ahead. Don't wait for the microphone.
Come on.
Do I have to wait for the microphone?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I wanted to ask, much has been said about how the withdrawal from Afghanistan may have seemed to the Russians and may have encouraged the incursion into Ukraine. But I want to hear your comment, maybe from both of you, from more recent events. So recently, the Europeans with the US told to Russia that there will be no talks without a ceasefire. And then in about less than 24 hours, told Zelensky to go to Istanbul without any ceasefire and talk to the Russians. So what signal would you say that sends about our resolve to the Russians? Thank you.
Well, what we've seen actually are now 3 instances where U.S. President has threatened that, in 2 weeks or whatever it is, we'll have to take a different approach. We'll see if this time actually really matters. See, there's another 2-week clock that was just begun in the last 24 or 48 hours. I would very much support the notion that the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, which occasioned the withdrawal of everyone else, and is indicative of the idea that they're going to do it without the U.S., but that withdrawal, I think, did send a message to Moscow that the U.S. probably won't be all that exercised or can't mobilize that quickly if Russia attacks the way that it did in February 2022. Now, to their credit, I think the administration did a superb job, very impressive job, of leading the Western response to that unprovoked, brutal aggression, but then temporized far too long over individual issues like the M1 tank, which prevented the Leopard decision in Germany. F-16s, a blind man in a dark night could see there's no more MiGs anywhere in Europe or anywhere else in the world that we could get them to provide them. It had to be the F-16 because it's the most ubiquitous fighter. I'd love to have seen it be the Swedish Gripen, which might have been even better for that the rugged circumstances, but there's just not enough of them out there, so you're not going to have lots of countries giving lots of aircraft the way that is actually materializing with the F-16 and many, many others. The multiple launch rocket system, then the improved conventional munitions and lifting the limits on the Army tactical missiles and so forth and so on. And I think that was very, very unhelpful for the Ukrainians to go through that, where each time they would ask for it, they'd be told no, then well, maybe, and then eventually they'd get it instead of the kind of swift and decisive action that would have been so much more helpful to the Ukrainians. The bottom line still, I think, and we'll get into this, I think, in the next session somewhat, is that we should have done so much for the Ukrainians that they could change the dynamic on the battlefield to one that shows Moscow that they cannot achieve additional gains at acceptable cost, knowing that what's acceptable to them is really quite astronomical. But that would have been what it is that we should have done, and we still should do. If we really want to get Russia negotiating seriously, they have to be convinced that they cannot continue to achieve what are really just incremental gains at huge cost, but they still have maximalist objectives. They still want to control not just all 4 of these provinces and Crimea. They want to topple Zelensky and replace him with a Russian puppet so they control all of Ukraine. And once that's done, you're going to see them start to focus toward, I'd say, one of the Baltic states. Lithuania has featured prominently in his speeches, and we should be listening. We should have listened a lot more when he answered that question about what was the worst geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. You could have chosen World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, any others. And his response was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. That gives you an insight into his grievance-filled, revanchist, revisionist history.
Nothing to add to that on the military side, but you could also throw in the economic side. Europe announced the 17th package of sanctions.
Yes.
17th? Mm-hmm. It's taken 17 packages, and we're still not there, interrupting the oil and the gas and the rest of it. 17 packages. Think about that. I'm sorry, we have run out of time. If you've got questions, of course, you still have the panel, and you'll have the chance.
And the best is yet to come.
The best is yet to come to answer your questions. We're going to move over to the panel, but let me, on your behalf, first of all, thank General David. We've always thanked him for his leadership in Iraq and Afghanistan, but we thank him today for the insights that he has drawn from that experience and shared with us. Thank you.
And
very
we
much.
thank you, Sir Michael. Thank you.
Godson. I will only say that I'm the only lawyer on this panel, but I can reassure everyone that the reason why a lawyer is chairing the panel is not because Lord Godson has suddenly been converted to the idea that lawyers should lead the military. I think the reason is that the topic of the panel is legal challenges to effective deterrence, and Policy Exchange had a report on 2 conventions, the Ottawa Convention and the Oslo Convention, which I co-authored. So the topic of our panel is one where lawyers will have something to say, and I have something to say that I will share in due course. In terms of the arrangement of the panel, General Petraeus will deliver a paper of about 12-14 minutes, and then after that, Air Chief Marshal Stewart, Lord Peach, will respond 5 or 6 minutes, and then we will have a handover to General Lindberg, a general and a politician who will also speak for about 5 or 6 minutes.
Only.
5 or 6 minutes only, yes. Right, General Petraeus, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for the very mercifully short introduction, which means that I don't have to be reminded yet again that I was runner-up for Time Person of the Year in 2007 to Vladimir Putin. And I do want you to know that Lord Godson has very much become a huge proponent of lawfare, which is what this is all about. I say that very much tongue-in-cheek, as you would imagine. But good afternoon to all of you. Thanks for joining us here at Policy Exchange. The institution is featured so prominently in discussions of the issue we'll address today, the specific issue, just as it has in discussing so many important issues over the decades. This is an institution for which I have long had considerable admiration and significant affection, not just for what it has done over the decades, but also for the admirable way in which it has done it. And with that, I want to applaud yet again the exceptional leadership of the Lord Godson of Thorney Island, which is this area we are in right now, who joined Policy Exchange 20 years ago. It's not Lord Guthrie of Craigiebank, but it's close, Dean, who joined Policy Exchange 20 years ago and has led it with a very steady hand for the last 12 years. Dean, thank you for all that you have done. I also want to commend the exceptional staff members of Policy Exchange, as they are the ones who have repeatedly over the years turned their directors' big ideas into reality, whether through events like this one or through briefings from members of Parliament and the press, or through influential monographs on the most important issues of the day, such as the compelling Policy Exchange study that was published on today's subject, which you indeed had the pen for and provided that wonderful lawyerly expertise. Our discussion today comes at a pivotal moment in European, Eurasian, and transatlantic politics. Russia's war on Ukraine is at a critical juncture, and strong, determined, and principled Western support is urgently needed to help bring the devastation in Ukraine to an end. The reality is, however, that at this critical juncture, America's policy toward Ukraine and NATO is somewhat uncertain. Europe's rearmament, despite heartening actions and commitments by the EU Council and numerous countries in Europe, especially Germany, has not yet achieved the momentum so desperately needed. And the exceedingly skilled, determined, and innovative Ukrainian military forces still have not been enabled sufficiently to change the dynamic on the battlefield, the goal of which should be to convince Vladimir Putin that Russian forces cannot achieve additional gains at acceptable costs, and thus that he should agree to a durable, sustainable ceasefire. In fact, instead of negotiating in good faith, Moscow still senses a strategic opportunity. Instead of heeding European and American calls for a ceasefire, Vladimir Putin continues to press the fight. And despite sustaining unimaginable losses for incremental gains, Moscow still hopes that it can drive a wedge between Europe and North America, sow division between European members of NATO, and achieve its maximalist objectives in Ukraine. In this dangerous climate, the question of credible deterrence founded on robust military power is more important than at any time since the end of the Cold War. And with uncertainty surrounding the future of U.S. commitments to Europe, it is vital that the continent's militaries are expeditiously equipped with the capabilities needed to deter and, if necessary, defeat further Russian aggression. The subject of our discussions here today is, of course, cluster munitions and anti-personnel landmines. And as a number of NATO nations, particularly those in Eastern Europe, have come to recognize in recent years, these weapons are among the capabilities that should feature prominently in military arsenals. Both of these categories of weapons are unique in their ability to delay, disrupt, and attrit invading forces, despite international legal efforts in the past to prescribe their use. They are thus of irreplaceable value for countries bordering the Russian Federation, as well as for those within potential reach of Russian ground forces, and for countries like the US and UK that have forces deployed on the soil of allies in proximity to Russia. The same is, of course, true for countries like the Republic of Korea, which has forces deployed along the demilitarized zone that separates it from the, quote, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and true for a number of other countries in similar situations around the world as well. Of course, my own country has long recognized the value of these weapons to self-defense, as well as to some offensive operations. Accordingly, albeit after unconscionable delay, the U.S. provided weapons with cluster munitions to Ukraine, where they have proven of enormous value against Russian targets on the battlefield. Beyond that, all of our potential adversaries, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China, have cluster munitions and anti-personnel mines in their arsenals of weapons. None of them has been troubled by international lawyers' opinions that these capabilities ought to be forsworn. In view of all that, countries whose very survival might hang in the balance in the face of aggression increasingly recognize that the submunitions that comprise cluster munitions can, depending on their type, very effectively destroy military vehicles, large numbers of enemy troops, and even important airfields and other military infrastructure that cover a considerable area. Anti-personnel landmines are equally important in various contingencies, owing to their ability to reinforce defensive lines, slow down advancing forces, and canalize them into prepositioned kill zones. They thus provide critical capabilities to territorial defense against an invading force, which is why, again, the US and South Korea have not signed up to the Ottawa Treaty. In fact, we cannot escape the reality that anti-personnel landmines have contributed to the maintenance of the uneasy armistice along the Korean border for nearly 71 years. Here in Europe, we can see the effectiveness and importance of these weapons as well. Day after day, Ukrainian armed forces have held back Russian troops with cluster munitions and anti-personnel landmines, together with, to be sure, a staggering number of drones, substantial artillery assets, and determined soldiers on the ground. In fact, Ukraine has frustrated achievement of the maximalist objectives of Putin's war machine for over 3 years using this very combination of capabilities. I saw firsthand the effectiveness of cluster munitions on the battlefield when we employed them via our multiple launch rocket systems during the fight to Baghdad in 2003. I also saw the devastating operational utility of the cluster munitions and anti-personnel landmines that were employed in southeastern Ukraine when I visited the front lines in Donetsk in 2019. And I have heard vivid accounts of the effectiveness of such weapons used by both Ukrainian and Russian forces during my 6 visits to Ukraine since February 2022. Indeed, among the most difficult obstacles the Ukrainian forces encountered in their counteroffensive in the summer of 2023 were multiple belts of extensive Russian minefields that featured much greater than doctrinal density of both anti-tank and anti-personnel minefields employed together. Russia has experienced the same difficulties itself since late 2023, as its forces have continuously assaulted Ukrainian positions where defenses include such weapons, and whose US-provided multiple launch rocket systems have also employed improved conventional munitions with cluster bomblets with often devastating results. Given all this experience, and in view of the threat posed by Russia to the NATO nations closest to it, Europe cannot afford to place itself at a strategic disadvantage by not employing weapons that have particular importance to defense against aggression. further Russian aggression, that is. To be sure, the post-Cold War legal prohibitions on these weapons were conceived by the well-meaning impulse to limit the violence that accompanies and follows war, as a small percentage of cluster munitions do not explode and remain hazardous, just as the anti-personnel mines that cannot be detonated, which is most of them, pose great hazard long after wars come to an end. But the effect of the prohibitions by the laws and conventions on those countries party to them has been to constrain their options for strengthening deterrence and defensive positions. In fact, I strongly recommend a careful review of Policy Exchange's superb recent report, The Ottawa Treaty and Convention on Cluster Munitions, Can We Still Afford Them?, on this very subject. Beyond that, to mitigate the risks of such munitions after a war is over, I strongly recommend the production and employment of self-destructing or self-deactivating anti-personnel mines and cluster munitions with the lowest possible failure rates as well. Each of these actions would reduce significantly the amount of unexploded ordnance that could pose a threat to civilians in a post-conflict situation. Again, cluster munitions and anti-personnel mines have helped Ukraine enormously in recent years, and they will undoubtedly prove to be similarly indispensable to deterrence and, if necessary, defense elsewhere in Europe in the years that lie ahead. Russia is, of course, already directly menacing Eastern Europe and the Baltic and Scandinavian countries directly. And Russian intelligence operations, for example, have intensified markedly since 2022. Just weeks ago, Poland confirmed that Russian intelligence services organized the fire that destroyed a major Warsaw shopping center. Additionally, a massive Russian cyber campaign has been identified as targeting critical transportation infrastructure, a campaign designed to disrupt alliance military cohesion and support for Ukraine. And just last week, a Russian fighter aircraft escorted a shadow tanker to a Russian port rather than follow the instructions of the Baltic state whose waters the tanker had entered. Beyond that, there have been, of course, numerous instances of Russian ships dragging anchors and cutting telecoms cables in the Baltic. Also of concern, Russia has been steadily improving its military infrastructure along its new Scandinavian border with NATO. Moscow's current capabilities have, to be sure, been attrited in the face of dogged Ukrainian resistance, for which, once again, anti-personnel landmines and cluster munitions have been indispensable. Russian forces have sustained staggering numbers of killed and wounded, approaching 1 million by the UK intelligence releases. And 500,000 of them have been so seriously wounded or killed that they could not return to the battlefield. Moscow's intentions nonetheless are clear. Russia is planning for a war with Europe even as it continues to pursue its objectives in Ukraine, and it will do so until we provide Ukraine the kind of support that we should have given that country years ago. A Russian attack might come in the narrow Suwalki Gap, which separates the Baltic states from the rest of European countries. Alternatively, it could mount an offensive in the vast Finnish forests along the border with Russia, or in Karelia, where Soviet divisions once sought to crush Helsinki's resistance. Or it might come directly against the Baltic states, on whose soil many NATO nations have deployed forces. Such an attack might simply be a probe of Western resolve or a substantial offensive. But without cluster munitions and anti-personnel landmines to counter Russian assaults, Europe's front line will be extremely vulnerable to even a moderate stress test. In a broader war, defending the maneuver bottlenecks in open plains requires landmines, anti-personnel as well as anti-tank, and cluster munitions. Now, the UK and other signatories to the legal conventions do not actually dispute the need for cluster munitions and anti-personnel mines. Far from it. When the Convention on Cluster Munitions was being drafted, the UK and other European partners inserted Article 21, which granted legal immunity to signatory states who participate in joint operations with non-signatories using cluster munitions. A generous interpretation of this action might suggest that it is somewhat contradictory. A less charitable assessment would be to observe that this is a form of legal freeloading, taking the moral high ground and immunity while depending on the US or other allies to commit the necessary evils for NATO's collective defense. The paradox of such conventions is that by attempting to reduce the violence of warfare and potential harm to civilians, they have also reduced the effectiveness of deterrence by limiting the effectiveness of defensive preparations and denying the defender some of the most important capabilities for resisting aggression. Beyond that, the result of the corrosion of Allied legal and operational cohesion is that our collective deterrence is at its weakest just when the threats are the greatest. This state of affairs was never truly acceptable, however high-minded the motivation at the outset. But now this situation is unsustainable. What seemed reasonable in the absence of threats in the early post-Cold War era is now unconscionable. And in view of all that, I commend Policy Exchange for having the intellectual clarity and moral courage to bring this issue to the forefront of the public discussion so that it can be properly resolved. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, General Petraeus. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions, but before that, we turn to Air Chief Marshal, former Air Chief Marshal Lord Peach, and then to Lord Lindberg. Lord Peach, perhaps.
Thank you. First. And Lord Godson, Dean, thank you very much for the invitation. And I too echo General Petraeus' remarks about both the work of Policy Exchange, but Dean, your consistent support for challenging how the law was being, not the law itself has evolved, but how it's been interpreted. And I think that's the heart of this discussion. General Petraeus, David, you've set out very clearly, very eloquently, what is happening in our continent. Actually, you could say what is happening in our world. You reminded us of the situation frozen as it is on the Korean Peninsula. And there's still conflict in the Middle East. But the plain fact is, I grew up with 50 years military service behind me now, but during that 50 years, there was a framework for arms control around the globe from the strategic level, constraining nuclear weapons, agreed mutually by the Soviet Union and the United States, down to the tactical level, as we've heard, for the excellent work that Policy Exchange has produced. And I speak now, fast forward to the end of my military career, as the chair of the Military Committee of NATO, and I was party to the observation that that framework was collapsed. It was collapsing before our eyes. And we did not collapse it. Those of us who have put it together and adhered to it and developed it did not collapse it. Russia collapsed it. And that's a fact, that the arms control framework has all but gone and is not in any fresh state of renewal. So therefore, my simple deduction is that the situation has changed. The situation in which those extra limits, those extra constraints that you've heard about from General Petraeus, has now changed, and therefore we need to think again. It's simple, but it's necessary. It's also urgent because war is being waged on our continent. And I'm sure my friend, it's so good to see you again, former Chief of Defence from Finland, will make that case very clearly and very eloquently. And we are not necessarily looking to sow landmines around the UK yet, but we may yet be required to fight for our own islands along with other nations, because the threat that General Petraeus paints is very real and very proximate to the UK. And so there is a need, I think, if I may just use this, Dean, in a slight platform sense, there is a need to reframe our narrative on defence, both through strategic defence reviews, but also the widening narrative of the risks and threat we face without frightening everybody to this is now a serious world with real military risks. We see the wider total war, I would call it, practiced by Russia. You brought it out very clearly. You could argue we're in an intelligence war now. That war is also not just about spying and espionage, stealing IP and all the other things that the threat actors, those who wish our way of life harm and our people harm, get up to. It's more than that. Subversion and sabotage is what it used to be called, and it is still called. And Russia is doing it. Mysterious explosions across Europe, not just in one or two places aligned with Ukraine by geography. All over Europe, a lot of explosive factories have gone bang, not because of lack of health and safety, but because they've been sabotaged. And subversion continues. And there's a fine line, and the General brought it out, between the cyber attacks that wish us harm and then commit harm and the support to the Russian forces on the battlefield. And the various other criminal enterprises that no doubt have also got links to states that wish us harm. So not only has the situation changed, I think our need for a regulatory framework and how we fit into it, if we're to sustain the credibility of our deterrence, is needed more than ever. We need to be vigilant. We need to have NATO procedures that we follow with our allies that are robust, that follow the relevant laws where they're applied to war, and that the UK Armed Forces, throughout my entire service, I can say with absolute clear conscience, followed the law of armed conflict. But now we need deterrence to rest upon credibility. At the heart of all deterrence is credibility. It's not just about the credibility of the forces. Are they up to the job? It's also about the equipment. Is it capable? And it's also then about the will to use it. And it is that I will leave you as a thought. It's not just about having the stuff and having the people. It's then about having the right narrative for defense in echelon. By echelon I mean regular and reserve, with national defense in time of crisis, as part of our alliance, working with 32 allies with whom we have close relationships, in a NATO command structure which is relevant, fit for purpose and agile to fight the wars we are forced to fight rather than those we created. Because the difference, and I say this loud and clear at this forum, the difference is Russia has created wars. NATO is a defensive alliance of sovereign states who have come together as volunteers to defend each other in time of need. And we, in order to deliver that deterrence and defense to those 32 allies, we need to have the will to use force if we need to. And that's the heart of this discussion. It's not just a nicety about this conundrum, which we've discussed here before about what constitutes policy, rules of engagement is a classic example, the law of armed conflict, and then international law as it applies to conflict. They're all subtle differences, and they can be debated at length. It's really at heart about having a military alliance called NATO at a state of readiness with command and control to allocate forces to deter and, if necessary, defend. That is what NATO is for, and in order to deliver that, it needs a framework which is reset to the world we're in and not the world we wanted it to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lord Peach. And just on the point that you made about the credibility of the deterrence, and the fact that, as you said, we comply with the law of armed conflict. Being a nation that complies once it ratifies also creates an opportunity in terms of deterrence, because by choosing to withdraw from that which we previously accepted because the conditions have changed, we can send a signal that can deter, because our adversaries know that if we comply, we ratify, and if we come out, we are ready to use it. Okay. So that's, in a sense, the opportunity. General Lindberg, now you're a former general and a politician, so you come to this with two perspectives. Please.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation from Policy Exchange and Lord Godson. Great to be here. And thank you for General Petraeus and Lord Peach, very elegantly put, and you covered a lot of that already. So I wrote 3 pages, but I'll skip them, and I'll give a Finnish update in 5 minutes. I tried to do it in 5 minutes. I'm a politician now, so it may take a bit longer. But anyway, so Finland was the last EU nation that joined the Ottawa Convention in 2012, because in our operational planning, we saw the landmines, meaning the anti-tank mines and anti-personnel mines, to be so important. We didn't join the Oslo Convention on cluster munitions, so we have them. We bought all the Dutch multiple rocket launchers and also the Danish rocket launchers, and we have some of the rockets that have cluster warheads, but we upgraded the fire control system so that they can handle the newer alternate warhead, which doesn't have the sub-munition, so the problem isn't there, and then the longer range GMLRs rockets and also the extended range, and we have bought a lot of them, and they are important for the army, and we've seen how Ukraine has employed them. And by the Ottawa Convention, you have to destroy all your mines and stockpiles within 4 years. So there was a person who came to my office in August 2015, and he told me that, sir, we have now destroyed all the mines. 1 million mines. Just easy to remember, million mines. And we had 200,000 of the kind of a very basic, simple pipe mines, where you have a metal pipe and then you put some throttle in it, and then we had 800,000 of where you have this kind of a triangular cone, you step on it and it blows up. So they were all destroyed, and that was the situation. But as we now know, situation in Europe has changed, and half of NATO's border against Russia is Finnish border, 1,340 kilometers of that. And last summer, the Minister of Defense gave tasking to the defense forces to study the lessons learned from Ukraine and how Ukraine operates and how they use infantry. And kind of the discussion erupted last December when the Finnish Chief of Defense, the current Chief of Defense, said that, okay, based on the study, we've learned that Russia uses and employs infantry, massed infantry, more than they used to do when they used the mechanized forces. And then there was a lot of discussion, and based on the study, then the government initiated a process, and we are now in the moment where yesterday, when I was leaving for the airport, the government proposal came to the parliament of withdrawing from the Ottawa Convention. And it will be now reviewed in the Law Committee and in the Defense Committee next week. And I'm a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and we are the ones who will write the final review in the Parliament for the plenary and for the vote. And so next week it's in the Defense Committee and in the Law Committee, and then within 2 weeks we have processed it probably in the Foreign Affairs Committee. Then it comes to the plenary, and then there is a break after the first session for 3 days, and then there's the vote. So it may be so that before Midsummer Eve there's a vote, and after the parliamentary vote it goes back to the government, and then the government and the president make a decision. So that could happen before the end of June. And then, if so, it's being sent to the Secretary General of the United Nations, and after he has received it, then it takes 6 months. So by the end of the year, the withdrawal might be official. And that's where we are in Finland at the moment. And then Finland has, if we go and manufacture the anti-personnel mines, then they are, storage. They are in storages. We don't spread them on the eastern border. But in case there is a conflict, then we will deploy them, and we will do it in a responsible way. We will mark them, and if we need to clear them, then we clear them away. But they are not in normal times along the eastern border of Finland. But if needed, we are prepared to use them. Thank you.
Thank you, General Lindberg. I will now invite questions from the floor. There are 3 rules. The first rule is that you have to wait for the microphone, otherwise people from home are not going to be able to hear you. The second rule is that you have to introduce yourself, name and organization, please. And the third rule is please keep it short. Right. There on the, sorry, 4th floor, yeah, 4th row, yeah.
Juliet Samuel from The Times. Going off what Lord Peach said, although I'd be interested in the other panelists' view as well, when a few weeks ago when Keir Starmer promised through the coalition of the willing that the UK was willing to deploy peacekeepers in Ukraine, I couldn't at that time or afterwards find anyone in private who believed that that was a credible possibility, even up to 5,000, let alone 10 or 30,000. I wondered whether you think that undermined our credibility and was irresponsible, or whether it was necessary to provide the message and the political support to Zelensky at the time, given what was happening in the US.
I'd be happy to start on that. I certainly don't think that it reduced your credibility. I think it actually enhanced it, because you saw the Prime Minister, together with President Macron of France, leading on the issue of trying to identify what would be a good security guarantee, which is also, frankly, proven to be very, very elusive all along. Indeed, the big question I have had is what could be a credible security guarantee, especially if the U.S. Is not going to be part of it. Something I thought was unfortunate was the use of the term peacekeeper. I really don't see this as a peacekeeping mission, having been engaged in at least 2 of those, I guess, in my lifetime, including a year in Bosnia. We really did need peacekeepers in Bosnia, because the Croats, Bosniaks, and Serbs were killing each other in huge numbers, and there was still, even after the Dayton Accord, necessity for forces to be on the ground to ensure that that didn't ensue again. And also to maintain security for some events that often proved to be very, very potentially inflammatory, like the return of the women to Srebrenica and so forth. The Ukrainian police can more than keep the peace in Ukraine once the Russians stop bombing them, shooting drones and missiles at them, and attacking them on the front lines. So the question really, again, is what would be something that would credibly convey a message that if you, Russia, break the ceasefire, because this is about something that would take place once a ceasefire has been agreed, what would guarantee that? In other words, what would pose such a substantial response that it would be taken very seriously by Russia, and there would not be flirtation with, again, violating the terms of that particular ceasefire. And to be candid, I've found that very, very difficult to construct, unless, say, the nations that are willing to put boots on the ground are willing to put them right on the front lines, essentially the way U.S. forces have been for so many decades in North Korea, albeit now just a modest U.S. contingent, the Joint Security Area, but very close to the demilitarized zone. And that's where I think that's difficult. I don't think you're going to see European nations that will put their troops right on the front lines. There's been talk about putting them back a bit. I don't know what that really conveys to Russia. Would that really be the kind of, quote, security guarantee? I mean, the great security guarantee would be substantial. It doesn't even need to be on Ukrainian soil. It could be air and missile forces deployed outside Ukraine that could respond very, very substantially to a Russian violation. But I don't see that kind of capability discussed in these various meetings that have been had. And so my default is actually to come back to something that I counsel anyway, which is provide Ukraine even more than they have been provided so far, so that they can use every means available to them. There won't be any dithering about that in capitals outside Ukraine. They will very, very forcefully respond. And again, this also would be part and parcel of, again, changing that dynamic in the battlefield that I talked about being so important earlier as well. So I think it was great to see the meetings, London, Paris, elsewhere, to see the 4 leaders, now adding Germany and Poland, go to Ukraine and meet with President Zelensky, and then also to bring President Trump in through a telephone to that particular visit. I think all of these have been very impressive, and again, great to see them show that initiative and lead the other European members of NATO. But I don't see yet something that would constitute the kind of very robust, basically, threat, which would actually guarantee security or guarantee the ceasefire and punish Russia if they were to violate that. Now, by the way, I don't think it should just be limited to military actions. I think the additional sanctions have already been great to see, and I hope that the U.S. will follow suit. And in fact, there are approaching 80 senators out of 100 who are going to sign on to a package that Senator Lindsey Graham, known to all of us well, is going to put forward. But you could have other threats. You could threaten to take that $300 billion of frozen reserves finally, once and for all, and just give it to Ukraine and enable them to not only reconstruct their damaged countryside, but also to produce a lot more unmanned systems. They have the capacity to produce 4 million unmanned systems of all type, not just air, but also ground and maritime, if they had the resources. They'll probably do somewhere around 2.5 or 3 million this year, having done 1.5 or 2 million last year. Again, provide them the wherewithal and present a new reality on the battlefield to President Putin, I think would be the best.
Lord Peach.
Well, I think I also agree with much of that, all of it actually, and I think it adds to the credibility that we're prepared to lead, is the important point. And of course, all wars tend to end badly or not as predicted by those who started them, and that's throughout history. So maybe it shouldn't surprise us, but the conditions, the way I would describe General Petraeus' very eloquent answer, the conditions have not yet been met. And they are unlikely to be met sitting here at the end of May. Will they be met at some point? But we can't quite. I struggle as well to understand what it actually looks like, and I strongly support the General in his call to continue to support Ukraine and all that that means.
Can just hear from General Lindberg briefly whether, in your view, the conditions have been met, but what is being proposed so far in terms of the coalition of the willing?
Well, I mean, you need to have the peace agreement anyway, and I'm glad that General Petraeus mentioned that it's not the peacekeeping operation, which I've been saying in Finland all along. So you get the wrong perception.
Yes.
If you think about the soldiers in blue helmets and then kind of the old desert and monitoring with your binoculars out there. So you need the peace agreement, and then how do you monitor it in a situation where the area is full of mines and drones and hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and then there is kind of, I get the feeling that for some people it seems to be so that the answer to all problems is an infantry battalion or an infantry company, whereas there are a lot of other capabilities. And then the mission, is it the reassurance mission or security guarantee mission with capabilities, as General Petraeus described, could be totally other things. And then, you know, obviously Finland being a nation bordering Russia, then there's a concern in Finland that, okay, if we pull a lot of troops from Finland, then Russia is still there.
On just a small point, I know there's stacks of questions. In the United Nations in the 1990s were attempts to try and resolve the inherent problem, as many of us experience for real, of being in a peace enforcement role whilst being called peacekeepers. And we didn't really close with that, both conceptually and doctrinally, when actually those of us served in the Balkans, we all know very well we were in a peace enforcement role whilst being called peacekeepers. So that was the wrong term. And that hasn't ever been resolved.
Yes. Can we go there just near you? Just that? Yeah, and then, let's start. Yes.
Thank you very much. Carol Walker from Times Radio. I just wanted to pick up on Juliet's point. Isn't there a risk, though, in all of this, that deterrence is totally lacking credibility when most of those who have expressed positive signals about being part of the coalition of the willing have made it clear that they'd only do it when there's a peace to keep, that they're not actually willing to put boots on the ground, as General Petraeus has mentioned, and that it is very difficult to see the circumstances when those countries would be prepared to do so, given that Russia has made it clear its view of foreign troops, troops that are in any way aligned with NATO on Ukraine's soil. Thank you.
Who wants to take this?
Stu, you want to lead?
Yeah.
Well, of course, the circumstances haven't yet revealed themselves where Russia is anywhere near a position of giving up on the war. And so it's hard to see the way in which the last few weeks have gone, certainly the last few days have gone for the Ukrainians. It's very hard to see how that will happen. When it happens, I think many of those caveats will melt away. And the art of command and control, and there's many people from the Ministry of Defence here, both serving and former, is to knit that together to make the mission work. And a lot of people have got experience of doing it. So the caveats, which is what you're describing, can be managed, but they can be also real, and that one of the moral courage requirements for a commander in an international environment is to be honest about the fact that he or she can or cannot achieve the mission depending on those sort of circumstances. The one thing I would say is that it's also up to nations to be honest about restrictions. The worst that can happen, and this is not related to Ukraine directly, is that nations don't declare their caveats and then provide private directions to their forces not to contribute in this mission or that mission. That's when the actually empowered commander has to say, no, you can't do that. And we could go back through the records of the 90s and beyond where some of that has happened. So we need to be very clear on what nations are signing up to, and those positions will change as the situation evolves. But sitting here today at the end of May in London, I can't see Russia being ready for peace.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, well.
Dare Farah-Hockley involved in resilience programme at Imperial College. General Lindberg, may I ask, should at 0300 tomorrow morning the Russians attempt an armed incursion on your very long border, will your troops respond under the law of armed conflict or a different law? If so, might you explain which, please?
Well, of course, by the law of armed conflict, and we have a reserve of 280,000 soldiers, so it's a very large reserve force that needs to be mobilized, and then obviously there needs to be a decision by the government, the president, and the parliament has to approve it, and then to abide by all international laws, as we are doing with the mines at the moment. So we're not party of the Oslo Convention, but we're party of the Ottawa Convention, and we abide the laws. And now we have initiated the process where, according to the international laws, we may withdraw from the convention. But everything is done legally, of course. There is no other way.
Yes, I mean, actually, the right to withdraw is provided for under each of these conventions. So there is nothing illegal about withdrawing. It's a perfectly legal step. You had your hand up.
Thank you very much. Philippe Lefebvre from the Centre for Britain Europe, also PhD candidate in military operations. What do you say to the argument regarding cluster munitions and mines that they are an outdated technology, that we have better forms of offensive technology, whether that is in airburst munitions, whether that's more precision-guided munitions, drones, that are better to focus on rather than spending political and physical capital on withdrawing from these conventions and re-entering the manufacturing of these rather complicated and dangerous weapons? Thank you.
I'd say as a former military commander, that I would want to employ all of the capabilities that are available, and these should be among those that are available. As I laid out, as I tried to lay out, for defensive operations, you very much want to have not just anti-tank mines, but anti-personnel mines. And you very much want to have the use of cluster munitions. Cluster munitions are proving to be very, very lethal and effective in Ukrainian operations, particularly. They've been very, very helpful there.
There's a gentleman with a hand up just next to Dean, I thought. No? No, sorry. You don't? Did I miss it?
Thank you very much. Alex Baker, Prosperity Institute. Lord Verdirame, you made the interesting point about being part of a convention as a form of deterrence itself. But we obviously heard from General Lindberg that realistically, if you do want to leave, it's going to take about 6 months before you can ratify. And that's before you can even start reproducing mines and cluster munitions. Do you think there's a way of separating use and stockpiling? And do you think participants of the conventions could start stockpiling so that we could then transfer those weapons to Ukraine as quickly as possible?
Well, under the terms of the conventions, we can't stockpile, we can't produce. The prohibition is on all of those activities, all the way down to use. So we couldn't start producing unless we leave the convention. The other problem with withdrawal is that it does not take effect if the armed conflict has already begun. And that is really the reason why I think the Baltic countries, Finland and Poland, decided that they had to do it before an armed conflict. Once it begins, it is too late. And in fact, Ukraine, which is a party to the Ottawa Convention, has found itself under a lot of criticism from humanitarian organizations because it is suggested that it is not permitted under that convention to use these weapons, even though the Russians are using them, because the armed conflict has already begun there and for some time. I don't know if any of you wants to.
Correct.
I would think there's creative minds could come up with ways to prepare forces, not only in terms of training, but perhaps other countries stockpiling these on their soil. I recall we provided the very sophisticated Javelin anti-tank guided missiles to Ukraine, but I don't think actually transferred them to them or something. They were in a ammo storage point in western Ukraine, and that proved very helpful actually when ultimately they were provided, and then huge additional numbers. Keep in mind that these are the ones that can attack from the top and from direct on, depending on how the operator chooses. And it's about a 3-kilometer range, and it's fire and forget, unlike what you and I had in the decades past, where you had to keep locked on the target as the tank is trying to slew over and hit you while you're keeping the X on the target. So again, I think there are probably creative ways that this could be addressed.
The white shirt just next to Dean has been...
Depending on the threat, obviously.
Yes.
My name is Jarmo Starkey from the Sun newspaper. I have a question about the laws of armed conflict in terms of which laws this country particularly and its allies should abide by, and specifically whether we're talking about the Geneva Convention or the European Court's Convention on Human Rights. And I ask that in the context of two sort of ongoing investigations, one into the activities of UK Special Forces in Afghanistan, General Petraeus, when you were COM ISAF, and of course also the ongoing threat of prosecution that hangs over veterans of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. So broad question is, what is your opinions, the panel, on those ongoing processes? And secondly, are UK troops governed or being held to account by the right laws or to the right laws of armed conflict?
Just say a few words on that. I think the law is the law. You can't choose which law you abide by. You have to abide by the law. But I think this is an area where quite a lot of confusion has been injected for the last 20, 30 years. To some extent, the confusion derives from the fact that for the last 20, 30 years, we've been fighting very different wars, and psychologically, especially in Europe, we haven't really been thinking about a large-scale war with a country like Russia. So we've been making statements that were based on premises that no longer obtain. Another source of confusion has been the relationship between human rights and the law of armed conflict. I think it is fair to say that until 30 years ago, there was greater clarity on the rules and on how those rules would be interpreted. because the rules had essentially been written by states, by legal advisors to defense ministries, by the armed forces, and so people knew what that signed up to. I think things have changed over the last 30 years, and it is one of the problems that we have to try to fix. In addition to things that we signed up to and that may no longer be fit for purpose, there is this wider problem of the things that we still think are fit for purpose, but are being interpreted in a way that is too expansive. I think, yes, next.
You know, the Policy Exchange has done some really good work, by the way, on these issues around lawfare, if you will, but pursuit of individuals for things that happened 20, 30, 40 years ago, and how they're actually incentivized, curiously, by certain policies and so forth that were practiced. And I'd commend that work to you, and I having participated in it, Roy, at that time.
I think just that, yes.
Patrick Hennessy, I'm a former soldier, now barrister, so I don't know whether that makes me poacher turned gamekeeper or vice versa in the context of lawfare. But when I was at Sandhurst, my colour sergeant instructor was a terrifying Scots Guardsman, loved landmines so much that he spat every time Princess Diana's name was mentioned. I think it's kind of important to remember the context of the decision to join up to those treaties was quite political and quite at the back of a very effective PR campaign. But my real question is this: a lot of far more distinguished soldiers in this room than I am, but they all earned their non-Article 5 NATO medal for operations in the Balkans. And it's interesting, well, landmines seem to me to be a tactical capability, cluster munitions a tactical capability. Surely the most important and effective deterrence is unwavering commitment to Article 5 of the NATO alliance.
Absolutely. And Article 5 is a very real commitment entered into freely by parliaments that choose to join the alliance. One of the differences between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, and there are many of them, was that everybody who is in NATO made a sovereign choice through their parliaments to join, just as most recently our friends from Finland made that choice. And therefore there is that solemn extent. The other thing that's really worth doing, and I speak as a former NATO official when I say this, is in the new headquarters in Brussels, the Washington Treaty is on perspex in large writing on the wall. And I say that not to be silly, but because it's such a good treaty. It takes about 8 to 9 minutes to read it. It's stood the test of time for 75 years, and it says all that needs to be said about creating and sustaining a multilateral, multinational military alliance that keeps 1.4 billion people safe and secure. And that makes very clear that Article 5 is at the heart of that treaty.
And the most important manifestation of Article 5 is the deployment of boots actually on the ground in countries that are threatened directly by Russia. And our countries have forces in the 3 Baltic states, and there's been no change to that deployment, even as there have been some pronouncements from Washington that emphasize, say, the Indo-Pacific over Europe and so forth.
There's been a hand up here in the first row for some time, sorry.
Thanks. Hi. Latika Burke from The Nightly Australia. Today we're talking about cluster munitions and landmines. Do you think tomorrow or down the track we might be talking about nuclear weapons? And that if the United States continues to behave the way it is, and given what General Petraeus said about the world becoming so much more dangerous, that there's a climate where more countries will seek nuclear weapons, where you think those countries might be and where the permissibility would be for what sort of countries might want to acquire nuclear weapons?
Look, I think one of the almost articles of faith has been that proliferation of nuclear weapons is something to be discouraged and avoided, because obviously the more countries that have nuclear weapons, the more the possibility of what we used to talk about as a loose nuke scenario, which is a particularly vexing one to resolve. As I recall, as the Central Command Commander, the Greater Middle East, we looked at what we would do if that actually materialized, and I can tell you it's very, very difficult to contend with that one. And it validated, really, I think, for all of us who participated in that exercise, that you should not allow additional countries to have nuclear weapons if at all possible. And I think that still is very much the consensus on this. And of course, here in Europe, there's more countries than the US that have nuclear weapons, as you well know.
I think you may have had in mind a statement by Prime Minister Tusk at the beginning of March where he referred to non-conventional weapons. But perhaps there is a trade-off between being more effective at conventional deterrence and reducing the incentive that other states may have to...
I was a speechwriter for the Supreme Allied Europe Commander when we did the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement. And you're taking away a very substantial capability at a time that NATO was outnumbered 3-to-1 in tanks, 3-to-1 in artillery, and 2-to-1 in armored personnel carriers. And so the SACEUR had to thread that needle very carefully and come up with a term buttress, that we needed to buttress the conventional capabilities that were available to NATO to offset the essential loss of these weapons, which of course he had to support because the political leaders of NATO had agreed to that accord.
But NATO is a nuclear alliance, and that fact is true. NATO has the nuclear planning group and those allies that choose to support the nuclear deterrent. I think there is a thought, though, for policy exchange and others, that we are in a world where perhaps we need to talk about this a bit more in small groups and discuss how we raise the collective knowledge about the future of nuclear deterrence as part of the wider conversation about defence.
We have time, I think, for one or two more questions. What's there? Yeah, sorry.
My name is Michael Stephen. I'm a former soldier, barrister, and member of Parliament. Obviously, before you can start talking about enforcing a peace, you have to have a peace. And it seems to me that the best way to get a peace in Ukraine is for President Trump to make it clear that he is going to give to the Ukrainians all the military, economic, and diplomatic support they need to make sure that they can defend themselves against any further aggression from the Russians. My simple question is, can anyone explain to us why President Trump is not doing this?
Well, after 2 more weeks, we'll see what happens. That's the latest. We'll see if there are additional sanctions following the lead of, I think, the admirable lead by European leaders. And again, don't limit this just to military. Again, there's $300 billion sitting in European countries, a little tranche in the US, that could be seized and provided to Ukraine that would be a game changer for them in many, many different respects. Not just, again, in buying additional weapon systems, which would be hugely helpful, but also in repairing the very heavily damaged electrical generation transmission grid, among others.
Well, what's Trump's thinking? Why is he not doing this?
I think that's... Perhaps you might ask someone from the U.S. government, or perhaps even the president of the White House itself.
One final question here, third row. So she's had her hand up for a while, and this will be the final one. Thank you.
Hiya. My name's Matilda Martin. I'm a journalist with Politics Home. My question specifically is for Lord Peach, something you said during your talk. You spoke about how we don't have landmines in the UK yet, after a bit of a pause. And I was just wondering, what would need to happen, do you think, for that to be considered
I meant in terms of we may need to consider defending the UK.
Yeah, so what would need to happen in order for that to be...
So we need to understand the threats to the UK as part of our strategic defence review and then its implementation. We need to understand the wider threats to the UK and not just the physical threat of conflict, but also, as General Petraeus made extremely clear, the very active intelligence operations conducted by Russia. That's what I meant.
Okay.
And we do need to take this seriously, is what I said, and that's all I'm asking for.
Thank you very much to everyone who's come, and thanks especially to our excellent speakers. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.